this case. So I agree with Mr. Buckley. We need to make a change in the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, because if you've earned a pension, you deserve to get the pension, and it shouldn't go to somebody else who came years after you put in that time and that work. Thank you.
The next question begins with Chris Buckley. With over 1 million Canadians unemployed, what is your stance on immigration?
Well, I understand. When I travel the streets, I listen to some people that talk about, the immigration rules and the guidelines and all these people coming into our country and people that are unemployed. But let's not forget, these are human beings as well. I think in this country, the richest country in the world, if we put the proper measures in place, if we spend the money in the proper places to ensure growth in all sectors of our economy, to ensure that workers are protected, to ensure that EI is beefed up, because not too long ago there was a surplus of $57 billion that evaporated that nobody can seem to find the Conservative government any longer, then you know what? People that have decided to make a choice and immigrate to Canada, because millions have for decades, can earn a good, decent living, and there should be enough wealth for everybody around this great country.
Thank you. James Morton.
Those who are unemployed.
I think we have to distinguish between two different types of immigration. One is the refugee immigration that Canada is legally obliged to take, and these are people who are in serious risk of death. And I don't think there should be any limitations on that. I think that's something that Canadians have long been good at, taking in those of the world who are risking death. But if we're talking about the general immigration policy, it should be focused on generating good things for Canada. And that's, in fairness, the way that we should go. And immigrants generally bring economic benefit to this country.
No, they don't.
Well, I'll disagree with you on that.
You would have to argue that.
Please.
I would have to disagree with you. And I'll say you something else. There's a general dislike whenever there's an economic downturn of immigrants. But I got to tell you, my parents came to this country looking for a better life, and they got it. And I think most of the people in this room, they or their parents did the same thing. And they worked hard, and they made a good living, and they brought up kids in this country and spent money and built businesses. So, yes, I think our immigration policy has to recognize Canadians and who's here now. But I also think that we have to recognize that immigrants bring benefits to Canada.
Thank you, James. And I am going to disagree with James somewhat. My father as well was an immigrant. And we're looking around this room, we're all immigrants here. And we came to this country to make it a better place. But what we had in front of the Parliament just before we went to this election was a bill to improve the refugee system. And I'm going to disagree with James, because there are people out there abusing Canada's very generous refugee system and our kindness and our goodness in the world. There was a ship that was outside, you may have heard of the Sun Sea. These were people from Sri Lanka paying $50,000 each to come to our shores. What happened in our system? We have people who want to come to Canada, people we want to have here, who are waiting in line doing it the proper way. What we wanted to do is tighten up the refugee system so people who are bringing illegal refugees into this country, there's going to be consequences for that, because we can't afford it. And it's just not fair that people who are going through the queues and waiting in line and doing these things properly, that they can't get into Canada when these other people jump the queue. So that was on the legislation right in front of Parliament just before we left, but unfortunately the opposition wanted to have this election instead, so we're going through that. But at the end of the day, things have to change. We have to recognize that people who wait in line should be processed appropriately.
Thank you, Colin. The next question will begin with James Morton. What are you and your party going to do to establish a national pension protection fund that will ensure that all private pensions are guaranteed in the event of bankruptcies?
Well, that's a very important point. And just before I even answer it, I want to jump in and say one other thing. Colin is absolutely right. People who are queue jumpers and fake refugees should not be allowed to stay in the country. And if I implied anything different, I didn't mean to. Pensions, pensions are critical, and that's something that we do have to focus on. In this country, about 75% of private sector employees have no RSP. What I suggest we need to do is to make sure that private pensions, that's pensions by GM, by Nortel, by whoever, are guaranteed in the same way that bank accounts are guaranteed. I'm not suggesting that top hat pensions where people are going to get millions and millions of dollars should be guaranteed that way, because we can't afford it. But I do think, and I repeat what I said before, if you've worked and you've earned a pension, you deserve to make sure you get it when you retire. This is something that's very important. I know my father and his concerns about a pension, and I know, frankly, myself and my concerns. So, I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, Carrie?
Thank you very much, James. One of the things that we have to realize as well, that 97% of pensions that are in this country are provincially regulated. So whether you like it or not, it's a fact. And what happens during an election platform campaign, sometimes certain candidates, certain parties sometimes try to blur that for political benefit. But the reality is these private pensions in Canada are regulated by the province, just like the GM pension was regulated by the province. And you may have remembered a provincial government under Bob Rae, an NDP government a while back, allowed the GM pension to become underfunded. In other words, any of you who are GM pensioners, you could pretty much take your pension today and cut it in half, and that's what would have been left of your pension if the NDP Bob Rae had his way. But again, we're very successful locally. We did work with our provincial government to top up General Motors' pension, and I think pensioners now, working with the company, working with the province, we have an agreement that we can be secure here. But overall, it is a provincially regulated pension format.
Chris Buckley?
Well, whether it's provincially regulated or not, I believe between the federal government and the provincial government, once again, pensions are important. We work all our lives to be able to retire with dignity and respect. So putting legislation in place that protects your pension that you earn is a must. And we'll go back to 1993 in the Bob Rae days. Absolutely, he put some measures in place. But every time afterwards, and think of how many governments have changed since Bob Rae was in place, nobody reversed it. As a union, we attempted to have General Motors dump money into that pension plan every time we went to bargaining. In fact, during the forced negotiations that our Conservative government put on us back in 2009, we were successful in putting $3.8 billion into our retirees' pension plans and $1.2 billion into health care. So over $5 billion was directed to retirees in General Motors, which are over 30,000 now. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question will go to Colin, Carrie. How does your party plan to pay for the promises they have made?
Thank you very much. Actually, we're the only party that has a plan. You may have heard of it, the Economic Action Plan. Let's be very clear. When we're getting back to the topic of balanced budgets, there's two ways to do it. One, you raise taxes, or one, you find efficiencies, you tighten your belt, and you grow the economy. We have this plan. You can only pay for billions in promises. The more money they take from you, that's the only way they can pay for it. Like, when you've got promises made by candidates and political parties, there's only one person to squeeze. It's you. They're going to have to raise taxes. What we put in place is an economic recovery plan that is working on growing the economy, creating jobs, and making sure that we have a balanced budget by 2014-2015. We're actually ahead of the game. We're about $5 billion ahead of that. The other parties have no plan. All they have are promises, very expensive promises that they're talking to you about during this election, and they have no way of figuring out how they're going to balance their budget at the end of the day, because nothing is costed, nothing is put forward in a practical way that they can pay for it, and the only person they can squeeze is you, the taxpayer.
Thank you. Chris Buckley?
Well, first of all, if you start creating good-paying jobs, not only in the community of Oshawa, but across the country, those workers making good money pay taxes. And those taxes that are paid goes into help funding projects. But if you continue to spend over $120 billion giving large corporations tax cuts that continue to eliminate good-paying jobs, if you blow over $1.5 billion on a G20 and didn't accomplish anything, if you spend over $50 million on a G8 up in the Halliburton area, you know, $100,000 for a gazebo, the list goes on and on and on. Let's look at the wasteful spending that's been taking place with the Conservatives and think about how much more good that money could go to working class Canadians, our seniors, and those that are jobless.
Thank you. James Morton.
Well, I have to agree a little bit with Colin on one thing. The only way that you can pay for any promises is through government revenues. Now, I disagree with him. The Liberal platform is costed. I can show it to anybody. It's online. You know, the numbers are there. What we do see, though, in the Conservative platform, we've got $10 to $13 billion for expanding prisons when the crime rate has dropped. We've got up to $30 billion for fighter jets, and what we really need is close combat stuff that we could actually use in places like Libya. And we've got $3 billion on consultants. And we still have government waste. We are talking about, and this is something that Chris just talked about, $50 million up in Huntsville. Think about what you could have done with that $50 million at the waterfront here. Fact of the matter is, this is not the time to cut taxes for the big corporations. It is not the time to raise taxes for everybody else. We will hold the line on taxes. We will not cut taxes, but we will not increase them. And we won't spend money on things we don't need. We'll spend it on health care.
Thank you. The next question will begin with Chris Buckley. Why do returning troops have to fight to get proper support, be that financial or health?
They shouldn't. They shouldn't. Absolutely, it's a disgrace. Those young women and men of all ages, are going to defend our country. They're going to defend democracy. And our government, any government, that treats returning soldiers the way they do, should be ashamed of themselves. They truly are. They are our sons, our daughters, our grandchildren, our nieces, our nephews. And they put their lives on the line every day. So at the end of their tour of duty, they should come home. They should be treated with dignity and respect and not ever have to worry about their health care or how they provide for themselves and their families. They should be taken care of for the rest of their lives.
Thank you. James Morton.
Obviously, this is something very close to the heart of people in Oshawa. We have the highway of heroes that runs right through town. Let me tell you something very specific. I met with a number of veterans, retired people a couple of days ago. And they told me that their pension was indexed to inflation, which of course makes sense. But that it used to be, until a couple of years ago, it used to be increased or amended, varied, whatever, every 3 months. Now it's increased once a year. Now that may seem like a small thing, but it's a big thing to them. The fact of the matter is, and I completely agree with Chris on this, our veterans deserve to be taken care of. They deserve to have education. That's one of the things in the Liberal platform. And they don't deserve to have sort of nickel and dime and bureaucracy. They put their lives on the line. They deserve to be given decent respect.